The earth at Gettysburg had never truly swallowed what it had been fed. By October of 1864, more than a year had crawled past since the battle that broke this town in half and fed its fields 50,000 bodies in 3 days. The townspeople spoke of healing. The newspapers printed reassurances. The churches held services of thanksgiving for a war whose end, they said, was finally within sight. But underneath all of it, underneath the repainted storefronts and the replanted fences and the freshly swept porches of homes that still had bullet holes in their eaves, the land itself refused to participate in the lie. When it rained, and in October it rained often, the water ran brown and then copper, carrying with it the faintest mineral sweetness that nobody talked about but everyone recognized. Bones surfaced, not full skeletons, rarely that, but single bones, turning up in garden rows, in drainage ditches, between the roots of oak trees that had been shattered by canister shot and were now growing back wrong, twisting sideways as if even the wood remembered the direction of the blast. A farmer on Cemetery Ridge found a jawbone lodged in a fence post. A child playing near the peach orchard turned up a leather cartridge box with a hand still inside it, the fingers blackened and curled inward like the legs of a dead spider. The smell, a low, sweet, clinging wrongness that lived in the soil and rose through the damp, had not gone away. It had simply grown quieter. It came up in the mornings, in the mist, before the sun had enough strength to burn it off. And anyone who had spent time around a surgical tent or a burial trench recognized it immediately. Marta Dross recognized it the moment she stepped off the supply wagon on the morning of October 11th. She was 26 years old. She had served as a combat nurse attached to the 2nd Corps field hospitals for 17 months, through Chancellorsville, through the wheat field, through the wilderness, and the things she had seen in those months had carved permanent furrows into her face that made her look older, harder, and more exhausted than any woman of 26 had any right to be. She was not tall, she was not physically imposing, but there was a quality to her stillness that unsettled people. When Marta Dross looked at a man, she looked at him the way a surgeon looks at a wound, assessing depth, assessing damage, deciding whether intervention would help or simply extend the suffering. Her eyes were gray-green, and they did not blink often enough. She had been reassigned to the Union Army Recovery Post on the edge of Gettysburg, a cluster of wooden buildings and canvas-roofed shelters that served as a way station for soldiers still convalescing from wounds sustained over the previous year. It was supposed to be a quieter posting. She had been told in exactly these words by her supervising surgeon that she needed rest, that the way in her hands had started trembling during amputations was becoming a concern, that a few months among soldiers who were healing rather than dying might do her good. Marta had said nothing to this. She had simply packed her kit and gone where she was told. The recovery post was run by a physician named Dr. Weston Fage, a meticulous, bespectacled man in his late 50s with the demeanor of someone who had learned long ago to keep his head down and his paperwork immaculate. He greeted Marta with the clipped courtesy of a man who was accustomed to receiving staff he hadn't requested and assigning them tasks he considered beneath his own attention. He told her, "You'll manage intake documentation and patient transfer logs. Everything is filed by regiment, then by date of admission, then by discharge or," he paused as if searching for the right word, "disposition." Marta sat at the desk that afternoon and began reviewing the logs. They were, as advertised, meticulous. Columns of names, ranks, regiments, dates of arrival, nature of wound, treatment administered, and outcome, discharged, transferred, or deceased, all written in Phage's precise, small hand. She worked through them methodically, tracing each entry with her fingertip, matching names to what she remembered of the men she had treated months before. It was numbing work, which was perhaps the point. And then she turned to a page near the back of the second volume, and her finger stopped. The name was Private Emmett Carl, 14th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry. She knew that name. She knew it because she had held Emmett Carl's leg down while a surgeon cut a meanie ball out of his thigh at a field hospital near the Trostel farm, and she had watched him scream himself unconscious, and she had stitched the wound herself when the surgeon moved on to the next man, and she had fed him water from a tin cup the following morning and told him that he was going to walk again. The log entry listed his transfer date, August 14, 1864, and his destination, Hollow Fen Chapel, 7 miles southeast of town, and in the final column, under Outcome, a single word, deceased. But the column next to it, Cause of Death, was blank. Marta stared at it. She turned the page. There were 2 more names she did not recognize, a Corporal Lyndon Hayes, 9th Massachusetts, and Private Josiah Meek, 6th Wisconsin, and both transferred to Hollow Fen Chapel within a week of Carl, and both listed as deceased, and for both of them, the cause of death column contained nothing, not wounds sustained, not infection, not fever, nothing at all, just the clean white emptiness of the paper, as if the act of writing the reason had been something Dr. Phage could not bring himself to do.
Marta closed the book quietly, pressing both palms flat against its cover the way one might press down on a wound to stop the bleeding. Then she stood and went to find Dr. Phage. She found him in the dispensary, measuring quinine powder with a hand that trembled almost as much as hers. She set the open ledger on the table in front of him and pointed to the entries. "What happened to these men?" Phage looked at the page. He looked at it for several seconds too long, the kind of pause that a person makes not because they are reading, but because they are deciding. "They died," he said, finally, "as the records indicate." "The records don't indicate anything," Marta said. Her voice was level. It was the voice she used when a soldier told her a wound didn't hurt. "There's no cause listed for any of them." "Sometimes death is not tidy enough to categorize, Miss Dross. I've seen 300 men die, Doctor. I have never once found it difficult to write down the reason." Phage removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly with a square of linen. "The chapel is operated by a man named Orcus Vale. He is a reverend. He volunteered to provide convalescent care for overflow patients we could not accommodate here. The arrangement was approved by the regional quartermaster." "And when the men died under his care, you didn't ask how?" "I was told they succumbed to their wounds." "By whom?" "By Vale himself." "And you wrote nothing in the log?" Phage replaced his spectacles and looked at Marta with the hollow, fragile expression of a man who had already convicted himself of something and did not wish to hear the verdict spoken aloud. "I wrote what I could verify," he said. "I could not verify what I had not seen, and I chose not to visit." The silence between them lasted 5 full seconds. 5 seconds in which Marta understood, with a clarity that felt almost surgical, that Dr. Weston Phage had suspected something was wrong at Hollow Fen Chapel, and that he had chosen, deliberately, with full knowledge of what that choice might mean, to look away. She took the ledger off his table. "I'm going to need a horse," she said. She did not find a horse immediately, but she found something better. She found Corvin Setch. Corvin Setch was drinking rye whiskey at the Ashford Tavern when Marta walked in that evening, a low-ceilinged, smoke-yellowed establishment 2 blocks from the town square that served as an unofficial headquarters for the war correspondents, quartermasters, and various species of profiteer who orbited the aftermath of battle like vultures following a column of infantry. He was 31 years old. He had been a correspondent for the Philadelphia Inquirer for 4 years, and he had been good at it. Good enough that his editors tolerated his temper, his drinking, and his habit of filing stories that made the army look worse than the enemy. Then, at Spotsylvania, a Confederate 12-pounder exploded 6 feet from the ditch he was sheltering in, and when the ringing in his ears stopped and the smoke cleared, his right hand was simply gone, taken off cleanly at the wrist, as if by a butcher's cleaver, and with it went the career he had built letter by letter in his cramped, confident, right-handed script. He had taught himself to write left-handed in the months since, and the result was legible, barely, but it came slowly, and every word cost him effort, and the effort made him angry, and the anger made the drinking, and the drinking made the writing worse, and so the cycle went. Marta sat down across from him without invitation. She placed the ledger on the table and opened it to the page with the 3 names. "You write for the Inquirer." Corvin glanced at her, then at the ledger. "I write for whoever hasn't stopped paying me yet. I need someone who can investigate a death, 3 deaths, maybe more. I'm a journalist, not a detective. In my experience, the difference is whether you carry a badge or a notebook." The corner of Corvin's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. He looked down at the ledger entries. He read them slowly, his eyes narrowing. Cause of death blank, all 3, same location. Hollow Fen Chapel, 7 miles southeast. I know the place, an old Lutheran chapel, hasn't had a regular congregation in a decade. Someone told me a reverend set up a convalescent ward there. I didn't think much of it. 3 men transferred there are dead. No one can tell me why. The doctor who signed the transfers won't even look at the page. Corvin leaned back in his chair and studied Marta with the kind of frank, appraising look that most men reserved for objects they were considering purchasing. She met it without flinching, and after a moment, whatever he saw in her face seemed to satisfy him. "All right," he said, "we'll go tomorrow morning, but we go as an inspection party. I still have credentials that look official enough to get through a door. And if there's nothing there, you're buying me a bottle of this swill to replace the one I'll miss by getting up early." They left at dawn. Hollow Fen Chapel sat in a shallow depression at the end of a rutted dirt road that branched off the Tunnytown Pike and wound through a stand of black walnut trees so thick and so old that their branches interlocked overhead like the ribs of a cathedral. The trees were shedding their leaves in the October chill, and the leaves lay on the ground in a dense, wet mat that muffled the sound of the horses' hooves so completely that the approach felt almost silent, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The chapel was stone, a heavy, graceless rectangle of local fieldstone with a single narrow steeple and windows of plain glass, several of which were cracked. It had the look of a building that had been built to endure rather than to inspire. Beside it, perhaps 40 feet to the south, stood a secondary structure, smaller, also stone, with a heavy wooden door and a single window that had been boarded over from the inside. A chimney rose from its roof, and from that chimney a thin thread of smoke was climbing into the pale morning air. Corvin saw the smoke and said nothing, but his eyes lingered on it. The Reverend Orcus Vale met them at the chapel door. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", and thin in the way that suggested not deprivation, but discipline, as if he had decided that the flesh was a distraction and had been steadily eliminating it. His hair was dark and combed flat against his skull. His eyes were pale, so pale they appeared almost colorless in the morning light, like water pooled on limestone. He wore a black frock coat buttoned to the throat, and his hands, which he held clasped in front of him, were long-fingered and extraordinarily clean. "Welcome," he said. His voice was measured, soft, and completely without warmth.
It was the voice of a man who had practiced control until it became indistinguishable from nature. I was not informed of an inspection. We're reviewing patient outcomes at all auxiliary care facilities, Corvin said, producing a folded document from his coat pocket with his remaining hand. Standard procedure. We won't take much of your time. Vale studied the document, which was, in fact, an expired press credential that Corvin had folded to obscure the date, and then returned it with a nod that suggested he had seen exactly what it was and chosen not to challenge it. He gestured them inside. The chapel interior was clean, too clean. The pews had been pushed against the walls, and the open floor space was arranged with 6 narrow cots, each made with military precision. 3 of the cots were occupied by soldiers in various states of bandaged recovery. They lay still and stared at the ceiling. None of them looked at Marta or Corvin when they entered. None of them moved at all. Marta's nostrils flared. Underneath the smell of wood smoke and tallow, there was something else, sharp, acrid, unmistakable. Carbolic acid, surgical disinfectant. She had spent 17 months breathing that smell in field hospitals, and she knew it the way a dog knows blood. She looked at Vale, and her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted. "You use carbolic acid here, Reverend?" she asked. "For cleaning. Hygiene is next to godliness, as they say." "They say cleanliness is next to godliness." "Do they?" Vale smiled. It was a smile that involved only the muscles of the mouth. Nothing else in his face participated. Corvin turned his attention to the secondary building. "What's in the outbuilding?" "Storage. Medical supplies, surplus blankets, communion equipment." "Communion equipment," Corvin repeated. "I am still a man of God, Mr. Setch. Mr. Setch. Even in wartime, the spirit requires nourishment. The chimney's smoking for a storage room. I keep a stove burning to prevent moisture damage to the supplies. The damp here is considerable." Vale's answers were smooth. They were immediate. They had the polished quality of responses that had been prepared in advance, turned over and over in the mind, until every edge was rounded. Marta watched his hands as he spoke. They never moved. They stayed clasped, still, the fingers interlaced with the precision of a surgical knot. They left 20 minutes later. They had not been permitted inside the secondary building. They rode in silence for half a mile before Corvin spoke. "He's lying. I know. The soldiers on those cots, they weren't convalescing. They were sedated or terrified. I've seen both. That was both." "I'm going back tonight," said Marta. Corvin looked at her. "You'll need a distraction. Can you provide one?" "I can provide a very annoying one." At 11 minutes past midnight, Marta Dross stood at the heavy wooden door of the secondary building at Hollow Fen Chapel. The moon was a thin sliver behind cloud cover. The black walnut trees creaked above her in a wind that carried the first genuine cold of the season. From inside the chapel, she could hear the muffled sound of Corvin's voice. He had returned alone, on foot, banging on the chapel door and announcing loudly that he represented the Sanitary Commission and demanded to review patient rosters. He could hear Vale's voice responding, low and taut with controlled irritation. The door was locked with an iron padlock. Marta had brought a pry bar from the recovery post supply shed. She worked the hasp free in 4 hard pulls, each one sending a dull metallic groan into the night that she was certain could be heard for 100 yards, but the voices in the chapel continued without interruption. Corvin was good at being annoying. She pushed the door open. The smell hit her first. Carbolic acid, yes, overwhelming, eye-watering, but underneath something older and heavier. Old blood, putrefaction, the sweet chemical stink of ether, faint but present, and something else she could not immediately name, a scorched, organic smell, like cauterized tissue.
She lit the small oil lantern she had brought and held it up. The room was perhaps 20 feet by 15. The walls were bare stone. The floor was wooden planking, rough-hewn and heavily stained with overlapping patterns of dark discoloration that could only be blood, old blood, layered over months, scrubbed but never fully removed, so that the grain of the wood had absorbed it and turned a permanent mottled rust brown. In the center of the room stood a table.
It was not a medical table, it was a farmhouse table, heavy oak, but it had been modified. Iron rings had been bolted to its surface at 6 points, 2 at the top corners, 2 at the sides, 2 at the bottom, and from each ring hung a short length of chain ending in a leather and iron restraint cuff. The surface of the table was scarred with hundreds of shallow cuts and gouges, as if whatever had lain upon it had fought against the restraints with a desperation that had driven fingernails and boot heels into the wood until the wood gave way. Along the far wall, on a set of rough wooden shelves, surgical instruments were arranged with fastidious precision. Marta recognized most of them: scalpels, bone saws, retractors, forceps. But there were others she did not recognize. Thin, needle-like probes of varying lengths, a set of what appeared to be small chisels, a hand-cranked trephine, a circular saw designed to bore holes in the human skull, with a bit that was still flecked with dried matter. And on a smaller table beside the shelves, arranged in a neat row, were 12 leather-bound journals. Marta opened the first one with hands that were steady. Steady because she had trained them to be steady, because in the field hospitals she had learned that the trembling came later, always later, and that the work demanded stillness first. The entry inside was precise, almost beautiful, a small, even copperplate script that would not have been out of place in a university lecture notebook. The author was clearly educated, clearly methodical, and clearly insane. The first entry was dated March 12, 1864. Subject 1. Private Harold Goss, 22nd Pennsylvania. Compound fracture left femur with moderate tissue necrosis. The wound itself is of no interest. The subject's nervous responses, however, present an ideal opportunity for systematic observation. Today, I performed the first incision along the lateral aspect of the left parietal bone, exposing a section of dura mater approximately 2 inches in diameter. The subject was fully conscious throughout, as the administration of anesthesia would compromise the very neurological responses I intend to document. Vocalizations were considerable. Note: Silas was required to apply additional manual restraint to the jaw to prevent the subject from biting through his own tongue. Marta turned the pages. The entries continued, dozens of them, each one more detailed than the last, each one describing, in the same calm and meticulous prose, procedures that no medical institution in the civilized world would have sanctioned. Trepanation, nerve excision, the systematic severing and reconnection of exposed nerve bundles to observe pain responses, the insertion of heated metal probes into the exposed brain tissue of conscious men to map which regions controlled speech, movement, sensation. The subjects were identified by name and rank. Their screams were described clinically, catalogued by duration and pitch, as if they were data points rather than the sounds of men being dismantled while alive. And then, halfway through the 7th journal, Marta found an entry that made her breath stop. Subject 9. Priscilla Alt, age 7 years. Daughter of a local tenant farmer deceased at Chancellorsville. The child was brought to Holofen by her mother, who believed I was operating a charitable hospital. The mother departed. The child remains. Her small cranial structure presents unique opportunities for study. The fontanelles, while largely closed at this age, offer thinner bone density along the coronal suture that facilitates trepanation with considerably less force than adult subjects. Began initial mapping of sensory responses today. The child did not scream. She made a sound I have not previously encountered, a high sustained keening, almost tonal, almost musical. It continued for 47 minutes by my watch before cessation. I believe the cessation was not due to exhaustion, but to a neurological event. Further observation required. Marta closed the journal. She pressed it against her chest and stood in the center of that room, in the amber glow of her lantern, and for 10 seconds she did not move. She did not breathe. She stood in the stillness the way she had stood in the field hospitals when a man she was trying to save died under her hands, not with shock, not with grief, but with a terrible focused clarity that felt like a blade being drawn across the inside of her skull. The stories shared on this channel are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real people living or dead, or to actual events, is purely coincidental. This content is created solely for spine-tingling entertainment. And if this content has value for you, give us a like, subscribe, and share a comment with the community. She gathered 3 of the journals, the ones containing the entries about Priscilla Alt and Private Emmett Carl, and shoved them into her satchel. She turned to leave. The doorway was filled by a man. He was enormous, 6'4", perhaps 6'5", with shoulders that seemed to span the entire frame. His face was wrong. It had been broken at some point, badly, and had healed without being set, so that the left side sat lower than the right, giving him a permanent expression of lopsided confusion that was somehow more frightening than rage. His jaw was massive and slightly open, revealing teeth that were cracked and uneven. His eyes, set deep in swollen orbital ridges, were small and dark and utterly empty of anything that Marta could recognize as thought. Silas Groom. He did not speak. He stepped forward and swung one hand, an open-palmed blow that was less a slap and more a demolition, carrying the full rotational force of a body that weighed well over 250 pounds. Marta ducked sideways, but not far enough. The heel of his palm caught her on the left shoulder and sent her crashing into the shelf of surgical instruments, which cascaded to the floor in a ringing avalanche of steel. She hit the ground, rolled, and came up with the first thing her hand found, a fire poker that had been leaning against the stove in the corner. Silas was already closing the distance, his boots thudding on the blood-stained floor, and Marta swung the poker in a flat arc that connected with his left arm with a sound like a mallet striking a side of beef. He grunted, a low animal sound, and kept coming. She swung again. This time the poker caught him across the ribs, and he staggered but did not stop. He grabbed the poker with one hand and wrenched it from her grip with a force that nearly dislocated her wrist. She stumbled backward. He raised the poker above his head, and the door of the chapel burst open. Corvin Setch came through it first, his left hand gripping a cavalry pistol he had borrowed or stolen from the recovery post. Behind him, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch, his face gaunt and his eyes wild, with the look of a man who had crawled out of his own grave, was Private Emmett Carl, alive. Marta saw him and understood. Corvin had not simply been providing a distraction, he had been investigating. He had found Coral, found him somewhere in the town or on the road or in whatever hole the man had crawled into after escaping from Hollowfen, and he had brought him here, living proof that the dead were not dead, that the records were lies, that Orcus Vale was not a reverend and Hollowfen Chapel was not a hospital, and the men who'd been sent here had not died of their wounds. "Put it down," Corvin said to Silas, his voice carrying the absolute calm of a man who had already been blown apart once and no longer regarded physical destruction as a particularly compelling threat. Silas looked at the pistol. He looked at Corvin. Something moved behind his empty eyes. Not intelligence exactly, but a dim animal recognition that the geometry of the situation had changed. He lowered the poker. Behind them, from the chapel doorway, came Orcus Vale. He stood in the threshold, his pale eyes moving from Corvin to Marta to the open journals on the floor. And his face, that composed, controlled, immaculate face, did not change. Not a flicker, not a tremor. He looked at the ruin of his secret with the same expression with which he might have observed a change in the weather. "You don't understand what I've achieved. I understand exactly what you've achieved." And then she hit him, not with the poker, with her fist, a compact, driving blow that came from her shoulder and connected with his jaw and sent him stumbling backward into the doorframe. It was not a blow driven by rage. It was driven by the same focused, terrible clarity that had carried her through 17 months of holding men down while their limbs were sawed off. It was professional. They bound Vale's wrists with the same leather restraint cuffs he had used on his subjects. Corvin stood over him with the pistol, while Marta went to find the girl. She found the access point in the chapel floor, a trap door beneath a pew that had been pushed against the wall, concealed by a woven rug that was too new, too clean for its surroundings. She pulled the trapdoor open and lowered herself into a crawl space, a shallow subterranean chamber, no more than 4 feet high, with dirt floor and stone walls that wept with condensation. Priscilla Alt was in the corner. She was sitting with her knees drawn up to her chest and her arms wrapped around them, and her face pressed into the hollow between her knees, so that nothing of her was visible except the crown of her head, a small dark circle of matted hair. She was wearing a cotton shift that had once been white and now gray with grime and stiffened with stains that Marta chose not to identify. She was impossibly thin. Her feet were bare and filthy, and her toes were curled inward, gripping the dirt floor as if she were trying to hold on to the earth itself. Marta knelt in front of her. She did not touch her. She did not speak immediately. She simply knelt there, in the damp and the dark, and waited. "Priscilla," she said. Her voice was soft. It was the softest sound she had made in 17 months. "My name is Marta. I'm a nurse. No one is going to hurt you anymore." The child did not look up. She did not make a sound. She did not move. She had passed beyond sound, beyond response, into a place where silence was not the absence of speech, but a fortification, a wall she had built around herself, stone by stone, in the dark beneath the floorboards of a chapel where a man who called himself a reverend had opened her skull to see what was inside. Marta took off her coat. She draped it over the child's shoulders gently, the way one might lay a blanket over a sleeping infant. Then she gathered her up, all 43 pounds of her, bones and silence and matted hair, and carried her up through the trapdoor and out of the chapel and into the October night, where the air smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke, and faintly, still, of the dead. It was Corvin Setch who carried the story forward. It was what he did. It was all he could do. The military authorities arrived at Hollow Fen Chapel 2 days later. They arrived not with the urgency of men seeking justice, but with the quiet efficiency of men seeking containment. A provost marshal named Colonel Aldrich Stain took custody of Orcus Vale and Silas Groom. He also took custody of all 12 journals. He interviewed Marta Dross for 40 minutes and Corvin Setch for 15. He thanked them both for their service. He told them that the matter would be handled with the gravity it deserved, and that they should not discuss it publicly, as doing so might compromise the investigation.
There was no investigation. In February of 1865, Orcus Vale was taken from a military stockade in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, escorted to a clearing behind the building, and shot by a firing squad of 6 men whose names were never recorded. The execution was not entered into any official log. No charges were read. No trial was held. Silas Groom, deemed mentally incompetent, was committed to a state institution in Danville, where he died of pneumonia in 1868. His death certificate listed his occupation as laborer. The chapel at Hollow Fen burned to the ground on the night of March 3, 1865. The official cause was listed as an accidental fire, origin unknown. The secondary building, the stone workroom with the scarred table and the iron rings, was demolished by a detail of soldiers who had been told they were clearing an unsafe structure. They were not told what the building had been used for.
They were not told about the stains on the floor. The 12 journals were never seen again. Private Emmett Carl was quietly discharged from the Army with a pension and a medical finding that attributed his injuries to combat. He settled in western Maryland, where he worked as a farrier and never spoke of Holofen for the rest of his life, which ended in 1891. Priscilla Ault was placed in the care of a women's charitable institution in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. She never spoke again, not a single word, for the remaining 62 years of her life. She died in 1926 at the age of 69 in the same institution where she had been placed as a child. Her death certificate listed her condition as congenital mutism, which was a lie, but by then the people who knew the truth were all dead, and lies have a way of outliving the liars. Corvin Setch did not obey the colonel's instruction to remain silent. He could not. Silence for a man who had already lost his writing hand and rebuilt his craft letter by letter with the wrong hand was not an option. It was a kind of death he refused to die twice. In the spring of 1865, he self-published a 47-page pamphlet titled The Holofen Record, an account of atrocities committed under the authority of neglect. He printed 400 copies on his own expense using a small press operated by a sympathetic printer in Germantown. He distributed 61 copies before the military police arrived at the printer's shop, seized the press plates, and confiscated every copy they could find. Corvin was arrested, held for 9 days, questioned, threatened with charges of sedition, and released without explanation. 339 copies were destroyed. Corvin kept one. He sealed it in an oilskin pouch and hid it behind a loose brick in the wall of his office on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia, where it remained, undiscovered, for over a century. Some histories do not end with justice. They end with the quiet institutional erasure of truth, the removal of documents, the burning of buildings, the reassignment of witnesses, the slow and deliberate burial of what happened under layers of official silence until the silence itself becomes the accepted record. But the earth remembers. The earth at Gettysburg still gives back what it was given, turning up bones and buttons and buckles in the rain, insisting on disclosure even when the institutions of men insist on forgetting. And the stone walls of Holofen Chapel, before they were pulled down and scattered and swallowed by the roots of the black walnut trees, those walls held the weight of what had happened inside them. They held the sounds, the hymns that Orcus Vale hummed while he worked, the screams that were not screams, but something beyond screaming, the sounds that human beings make when pain passes beyond communication and becomes something purely neurological, purely electrical, a signal firing into a void where no one is listening. And they held the silence of Priscilla Ault, the silence she carried with her for 62 years like a stone in her chest, a silence that was not emptiness, but evidence, the most damning evidence of all, because it could not be confiscated, could not be burned, could not be hidden behind a brick in a wall. It simply endured. Someone, eventually, always writes it down. Not because the writing changes what happened, it never does, but because the act of recording, the act of saying, "This happened here, to these people, and it was done by these hands," is the only answer that history has to the forces that would prefer it be forgotten. The earth holds what it is given. The silence speaks to those who listen closely enough. And somewhere in the wall of a building on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia, behind a loose brick, wrapped in oilskin, 47 pages still wait, patient, undestroyed, and unerased for the hand that will finally pull them into the light.